When I moved to the United States back in 1993, I remember going to Kmart to buy goods. I remember going to Sears, that's a local mall, to buy things. And if you look in 2023, 30 years later, both of these companies have virtually disappeared. And Walmart has become the de facto standard, especially in the United States. Walmart has 2.3 million employees now, so that's how large they have become. And they've become that large partially because they had excellent logistics, but also because they really were able to take advantage of the low cost of production in China, as well as the quantities that they were able to get over. So these low-cost products, it's not just that they were low cost, the quality kept on improving and the price kept on staying low. Now, in a normal market, prices would have to start increasing as more money flows into China, but that didn't happen. Prices kept on being low, and that's where dollar sterilization comes in. If you understand dollar sterilization, you will understand why the Chinese ended up accumulating so much US debt. You will understand why we kept inflation so low in the Western world the last decade, and why we ended up being able to print so much money and essentially have a money party in the last decade. And you will also understand why in the coming decade this is going to cost us, because there's no such thing as a free lunch in economics. So dollar sterilization is probably best explained with an example. If we take John Doe, for example, who is going to buy a pair of sneakers, let's say at Walmart. Walmart will have to take a portion of these $10 and send it to the Chinese manufacturer. Let's say, for example, that's at $6, and the $6 will be sent from a US bank over to the bank of the Chinese manufacturer. Now, in a normal market, the $6 would be converted into Chinese yuan for the Chinese manufacturer to pay their people. And that process would mean that the US dollars will be buying Chinese yuan, which over time will cause the Chinese yuan to appreciate versus the US dollar. And in economics, whenever you have a country which produces a lot and a country which consumes a lot, money essentially flows to the country producing a lot. The exchange rate rebalances and you will get a new equilibrium. But that did not happen in the case of China because of dollar sterilization. And dollar sterilization basically means that when our Walmart example sends the $6 to China, so $6 are actually taken by the Chinese central bank and are being sent right back to the US, usually in the form of the purchase of US bonds. And that's how China ended up accumulating, vast sums of US debt, because all these payments essentially arrived to the Chinese banks, were taken by the Chinese central banks, and sent right back to accumulate US debt. And that sterilized or neutralized the US dollar purchasing effect on the Chinese yuan, and it kept the currency exchange between the US dollar and the Chinese yuan, 7 yuan per US dollars, for a very long period of time, and it kept Chinese goods very cheap. Now, the Chinese manufacturer still has to be paid somehow. So how is he getting the yuan he needs to pay his employees? Well, the Central Bank of China essentially just printed that money to pay the Chinese manufacturer. And so that over time meant that the amount of currency in China ended up increasing by a lot. And it eventually caused goods and services in China to appreciate and become more expensive, causing inflation. And the last time I've been in China, before COVID, China was not a cheap place. If you buy a Starbucks in China, I think it was more expensive than the US nowadays. And it's just not the kind of place that it was 20 years ago. So Chinese products nowadays are becoming more and more expensive, even though the yuan is still being kept at 7-to-1 ratio. So it's important to remember that inflation is really determined by the amount of money which is chasing the amount of goods available. Only the money chasing it actually has an effect on inflation. And if we look at the dollar sterilization effects, the Chinese goods available in Walmart became ubiquitous throughout the United States. More and more people were able to enjoy these low costs, which reduce the amount of inflation in the US. But the thing to understand about inflation is it's really an aggregate number of all kind of services and goods that are being produced. So as Chinese goods, such as t-shirts and sneakers and so on, ended up reducing your bills, there were other services such as education, pharmaceuticals, homes, rents, and so on, which kept on going higher and higher. And in some ways, the low Chinese prices of goods ended up subsidizing these other goods, which were going to go higher and higher. Central banks were able to not have to worry about inflation and were able to reduce the interest rates, which made money very cheap. We became dependent on the cheap money. By the time 2022 came around, and interest rates started going up, we essentially had to pay the price for all of this. There's nothing free in economics. And China ended up printing a lot of yuan in order to pay the Chinese manufacturers because the dollars that they received went back to buy US treasuries. So there's a delayed effect with these sort of things where essentially the yuans are causing prices in China to rise in yuan terms. And so over time, the price of Chinese manufactured goods will become more and more expensive. And you can only keep these things artificially low so long. The low cost of Chinese goods over the past decade had a structural effect on inflation, which made it a lot lower than it should have been. But it is something that we'll have to pay for this decade. This decade, we're going to see higher inflation to partially make up for what we saw in the last decade, because there's no such thing as a free lunch. All that money that was created is going to start chasing those goods. And as the growth of new goods being produced and the efficiency and the cost is no longer going to be such the way it was in the past, trade wars and other things are going to make that goods a lot more expensive. And so we'll see a structural increase in inflation. And that's not just my opinion. Even if you look at the Singapore government, there was a recent statement by the Prime Minister saying and warning citizens that inflation is not something we should expect to go away soon. It is something that is a consequence of the past decade of ultra low inflation.